Hi, this is Manny Flores again. Welcome back to part two in my series of demos associated with my past experience and capabilities. Before we move on to Schlosser Forge, where we left off, I just wanted to go back and take the time to slowly go over some of these business cards here, just as a means of explanation. Again, D&M nameplate, post Lockheed, originally hired in as a planner and eventually became an estimator planner for Mr. McDonald. Moving on to Hollingshead, as I mentioned in my original video, cost estimator originally, and then ultimately a project specialist heading up their MRP implementation with Cymix. And you saw the letter in the first video where eventually I was promoted to their senior programs manager and master scheduler slash operations manager slash materials manager. So I did a little bit of everything for them, but it was a good experience. But it serves to demonstrate the progression of my career and ever increasing responsibility within the organization. Schlosser Forge, which we're going to touch on next, I don't actually have any business cards from them. Not sure what I did with those, but unfortunately I didn't retain one. But I'll be able to convey the extent of my involvement, very high level, with the subsequent screens. From Schlosser, I went to Richter Packaging. Richter was a agricultural packaging manufacturer. Did very well there with their implementation. Former Anderson software, I think the last iteration or upgrade for Anderson before they went belly up. But Richter did well, and they were sold to Tenneco, and I was retained by Tenneco as their master scheduler until I hired in over at Wedgestone, as I mentioned. And Wedgestone, this is Fay Automotive. That was a subsidiary of Wedgestone, who owned Fay, Sigma, Weston, and Monona Tube and Weld. So ultimately for Wedgestone, I implemented DataWorks at all four of their facilities. And then post Wedgestone, I moved on to their competitor, Smittybilt, and we'll cover that shortly. But I just wanted to give you an indication of the progression in the order here. After Smitty, post Y2K, again, as I mentioned, the manufacturing market more or less stagnated. I was able to migrate my skill set into public works contracting, hiring on with Reyes and Sons as their project manager. Did a couple of public works contracts with them. Very successful. Eventually got recruited by Brassfield. Brassfield Communications was one of our subcontractors while I was with Reyes. They hired me as their service manager, and unfortunately they were in financial trouble when I hired in. Didn't realize it at the time. So I spent about 9 months with them and did some positive things with their service department, but ultimately they folded up operations. I went back to work for Reyes and Sons, but this time I was hired back in as their ops guy, helped them formalize a lot of their operational activity, and got them involved with both MTA and LAUSD. I was the only guy on staff who had a degree, so it assisted in that respect. But ultimately, Reyes' business took a downturn at the tail end of 2010, and I went to work for one of their suppliers, what was Independent Electric. I ended up working for Independent Utility, and we did a unique thing with remote materials management for Southern California Edison. I was with them for about a year, and then ended up at Boron for a short period of time, and eventually back at over at CSI as a project manager slash estimator. So again, that was progression of my involvement from early on in the career, doing estimation and production planning, and ultimately into operations management and a lot of ERP implementation along the way. So I just wanted to give you that brief overview so that you had some kind of indication of where my involvement ends up over the course of my career. So getting back to Schlosser, as I said, they had a homegrown system. Because of Y2K, they recognized they were going to have to replace it. Along with Y2K, as long as they were looking at systems, they might as well do this MRP thing. And so I was hired, coming from a recent implementation with Cymex at Hollingshead, and quasi implementation effort over at Dimick Sheet Mail. So I want to say that here's one of my memorandums establishing myself in the production inventory management department. And Mr. Schlosser, Jeff, was actually the owner, Phil's son. Phil Schlosser had retired at this point. Jeff was his son. Jeff's degree was in forestry. Not a big fan of production and inventory management. My key supporters were Dan Close and Mark Ponson, Dan being the materials manager with 30 years at Schlosser, and Mark Ponson being the resident CPA. So between those two and Mr. Throckmorton in design engineering, that was my support group as I progressed through developing the concept of implementing formal MRP, ERP at Schlosser Forge. Now, in the meantime, here's another example of Microsoft Project. Everything I did at that time was in Project until we had the MRP system up and running. It gave me a nice centralized location to identify what I was doing, what had to be done, new tasks, old tasks, associated assignments for others, so I could keep them abreast of the fact that we were tracking our progress and that they needed to produce on time. But again, just a mild way of managing the requirements for the implementation. As you read in that earlier memo, I got the group involved with APIX. And because I was the director of programs with the Inland chapter, they'd pay back some benefits. And then we took on a small project to demonstrate the effectiveness of being able to schedule. Up until this point, their scheduling was more or less by hand, and a lot of grease boards on walls that weren't really coordinated. So in engineering, you had one schedule on a grease board on a wall. In production planning, you had another schedule up on a wall, and in machine operations, for example, you had yet a different schedule up on the wall, depending on what was actually available to produce at the time it hit the shop. So without any standards and without any formal routers, I enlisted the help of students at at DeVry. These were production and inventory management students who needed a year-end project as part of their final. I got free hourly help. They got the opportunity to get some real-life experience, and Schlosser benefited by having some real detailed statistical information gathered to support scheduling in the shop area. So as a result of that, here was their project plan, and ultimately here was the resulting scheduling project plan. So from that, we were able to convince the balance of management who were on the fence about the benefits of MRP and ERP and the solutions it could provide throughout the organization. Mr. Ponson, by this point, Jeff Schlosser had gone off to become a forest ranger. Mr. Ponson took over as temporarily interim president, and he tagged me with the responsibility of finding finding Schlosser the correct electronic solution for their IT requirements. I wrote this letter after doing a due diligence study throughout the organization, talking with all the key personnel, finding out what their current situation was in terms of information management, and going to the extent of asking what their dreams and desires were. What was nirvana? What was the ultimate in terms of information management for them, perceived? And again, you're working with a group who's been in an enclosed environment, hasn't had much. Not many of them were aware of what was available out there. So I put together this letter after interviewing everybody and coming up with these top 10 items, capabilities that the new system was going to have to supply. And then went out to my Apex brethren and asked them to provide me with their known suppliers. Sorry about that. Forgot to close my email. Sorry, that'll go away shortly. Oh, good. Everybody knows that my. I apologize. Okay. But at any rate, we had my Apex compatriots supply me with supporting information on what they knew about certain software packages that they had looked at. And I did some research on my own. We came up with a top 3 or 4. I presented that to the group, management group, and they elected to look at 3, primarily JobScope, ABBA, and DataWorks. You can see from these letters, and again, take your time to read through these. Yes, I was merely a master scheduler by all recognition officially within the Schlosser Forge organization. But as you can see from these letters, I was the key contact for every one of these organizations in terms of what Schlosser Forge was going to determine as their IT solution going forward. So ultimately, we settled on DataWorks, and DataWorks had a ManFact system that was amazing. Touchscreen capability before there was touchscreen recognition widely available in the industry. They had some redlining design capability that helped with our shop dimensioning that needed to be adjusted out on the shop floor due to inconsistencies with the forging process. That was all done through DataWorks, and that's what we elected to go with. The implementation was delayed because Mr. Ponson left the company, and Dan Close was his interim replacement, and Dan didn't want his first decision to be $1 million investment. He was just not comfortable with that kind of decision. So ultimately, once we settled on DataWorks and the group was established and I had done my training involving the implementation effort, I was contacted by the Richter Group. They had another unique situation in that their software system, MacPack, was Anderson software. If anybody remembers, Anderson at that point had gotten involved with some some legal problems, and their support of their software evaporated. Unfortunately, Richter had already bought MacPack, and they needed now someone who could understand it and implement it. They offered me a tremendous increase in salary, and DataWorks was stalled at Schlosser Forge, so I took the offer and went to work for them. Again, I'm going to try and keep this brief, so we're going to move on to I want to say video number 3 with Richter and Tenneco, and hopefully we'll get into Edgestone as well. But at any rate, thank you for your time in looking at this so far. Please take the time to slow this down, stop it, read through the documentation that on the screens that I've gone over, and we'll pick you up on video number 3 shortly. Again, my name is Manny Flores, and this is a brief overview of my past experience. Look forward to talking to you shortly.